Hi, everybody. Welcome to this live video. If you are a Sunny Slope, hi, everybody, and welcome to our live video here. This video is going to talk about the topic of race and how do we understand racial tensions that are ongoing. How do we kind of make sense of all of this? This is not an exhaustive video because it's obviously not a topic that can be fully fleshed out in just one video. So my intention here is to sort of begin the conversation, or at least continue the conversation, because I did a video about a week and a half ago, and I had some questions that came up from that I thought were really thought provoking, and so what I want to do is really for the next few weeks jump in and do a series of videos. Now, sometimes that's going to mean it'll be like a Facebook Live, like I'm doing right now. Sometimes it'll be a video that I just post because I got at least one interview lined up so far with a friend of mine that we're going to do. By the way, if you are a Sunny Slope member and you're looking for the update on what's happening this Sunday, I'll post that. I'll do that later this afternoon. So I'm sorry to um, um, keep you in suspense. But in any case, so about a week and a half ago, I did a video it was just it was an overview video. It covered an awful lot of ground in a relatively short amount of time, and I was we covered race, we covered church and politics, we covered some presidential politics and things, and so it was we were flying at 35,000 feet, so we weren't able to dig really deeply into the particulars. And number one, I was pleased with the response. I was pleased that we seemed to get a good number of people that actually tuned in and watched at least part of the video. So I was really grateful for that. I also got some, as I said earlier, some really good questions that came out of that. Some really and understandably, some of it aroused some emotion, passion, which is actually, it's a good thing. That's important. But it also then made me kind of think, because a couple people said, well, maybe you should do, should we do a Sunday school class? Should we do something more about this? And so this is my attempt at something more. Now, one of the things that you've noticed is, even in the week and a half or so since I did the video, of course, is that the national conversation on the topic of race has in some ways, it's really cooled down. I'm not saying it's gone away. I'm not saying that I'm not saying that the issue has gone away. I'm just saying that in terms of the protests and the riots and the raw anger has subsided. Now, this is really a crucial time, I think, because historically, um, you know, riots and protests and those kinds of responses are not new. That's not a new thing. They've actually happened many times, especially in the last 50, 60 years. Um, but what happens is the cycle. You get this sort of catalyzing moment, which brings the issues of race back into the forefront again, and then you get this real flare up of anger and outrage and reaction, and then things tend to settle back down again. Things tend to quiet down again for a little while, and until the next event, and the cycle kind of repeats itself. Now, Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State for the United States, wrote an article. I think it was in either, I don't remember if it was in the New York Times or Washington Post or where it was. I don't quite remember, but she wrote a really, what I thought was a really thoughtful article, and in it she says, she has a feeling that this time will be different. And of course, I would hope that she's right. I would hope that that's correct. Um, but the question is, how do you make sure that she's right? How do you make sure that this moment doesn't just sort of fizzle away and then the cycle repeats itself? And so I think this can be a really good catalyzing moment for Christians and for the church, to think through this issue, and what do we do about it, right? What is our role as Christians, and what is our role as a church? How should we as a church get involved? Should we get involved? To what extent? All those kinds of questions are really, they're all sort of woven into this. Now, as I'm saying this enough times so that so that you understand that this obviously cannot all be tackled in the next 30 minutes, not by a long shot. Obviously it's going to take some time to unpack this, but that's my goal. But I want us to be able to think through as Christians, how do we think through, how do we reflect on this, what do we do about it, how do we make sense of sort of the competing and the conflicting tensions that we see in our culture today. Now I want to spend a little bit of time trying to at least evaluate our current moment. How do and when I say that, I mean, how do we make sense of this, of the tension that we experience? And I think there's a lot of ways that you could cut that pie, right? There's a lot of ways you could kind of slice this all up. One of the things, though, is there's so the United States, especially in our context, has become increasingly polarized for lots of different reasons. One of the reasons is that well, one of the things that begins to happen, of course, is that liberals and conservatives tend to look at each other very, very differently, often with some suspicion. And I think one of the things that they have shown. By the way, this comes in part from a book by Jonathan Haidt. Here's the book. It's really it's he's Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian. In fact, he identifies as an atheist Jew, and he doesn't lean politically conservative. He leans more libertarian, but here's what he says. He says he identifies these moral principles that guide both liberals and conservatives. He says, there are six moral foundations that people have to greater or lesser extent. So by moral foundations, he means there's kind of these six um, key principles that people consider when they make decisions about right and wrong. And I'm not going to go into all of that. Maybe another time I'll try to unpack more of those. But it's really fascinating because he says if you lean politically or socially, if you lean to the left, if you tend to be more liberal, if you tend to vote Democrat, and by the way, he's backed this up with studies, so he's not just giving an opinion. He says one of the key moral principle that guides your decision making and guides your understanding of right and wrong. So that key underpinning idea is actually something very good. It's compassion, right? People who lean politically or socially to the left tend to focus big on caring for people. They don't want to hurt people. They don't want to see other people hurt. Now, what that means in our current moment is that what we're seeing is that people who lean politically and socially to the left, um, they tend to be more sensitive to issues of inequality and racial tension. They tend to be insensitive to injustice. They will pick up more quickly when a person or group of people are experiencing injustice or any kind of mistreatment. Right now, that's a good thing, right? I mean, care, as Haidt calls it, care and compassion is a good moral principle that can and should guide our decision making, and it should shape our way of looking at and making sense of the world around us. Now, the problem is, or the critique is, that often, well, one of them, there's more, and by the way, if you lean left, don't worry, I'm gonna turn to my right in a second, and I'll target people on the right in just a second. Um, what Haidt says is, and you've seen this too, is that often the method. So if you lean politically or socially to the left, your methodology or your sort of intuition is you are sensitive to people who are hurting, you're sensitive to people who are experiencing mistreatment or injustice and that sort of thing, and you want to do something about it. The problem is that sometimes the methods are not always the most effective. So, for example, if you are in a workplace, if you have a job in a company or corporation or even a small business, you have maybe had to go through like diversity training. It, and actually, it was so wonderfully parodied by The Office. You remember that? It was like in the first season, like it was one of the first two episodes they did, where they kind of they did this parody of the TV show The Office, where they were supposed to have diversity day and diversity training, and that parody it was kind of a satire, because it was, what it was doing was it was critiquing this methodology, and it was sort of how it's well-meaning and well-intentioned, but it can often have the opposite effect. And again, studies have shown this. What it can do unintentionally is that it reinforces the fact that we are not all one group here, right? And so if you work for a corporation, or you work for a company or business or a school or whatever, and you focus on all the things that make you different, that has the unintended side effect of reinforcing differences within the group, and that's That's one of the negative side effects. The other is maybe more pronounced for our moment here. The other negative consequence is that what we end up with is sort of an almost violent and angry approach that weighs heavily on guilt and hostility, and anyone who opposes your point of view, anyone who disagrees with you, anyone who holds to a different point of view, there is a push now towards just censorship, towards just shutting down any divergent point of view. This is an extreme example, but it sort of makes the point. It was a line from the Village Voice, which is a very liberal magazine in New York, kind of a weekly culture magazine in New York City. And the writer of this person obviously leans very left. He says, is Michael Feingold. He says, Republicans, talking about conservative people, Republicans don't believe in imagination, partly because they don't have any. Uh, and Republicans, whose goal it is to profit from disaster and who don't give a hoot about human beings. And he goes on, he says, which is why I personally think they should be exterminated before they cause any more harm. Now, I want to be careful, but this is one of these topics that I think is worth a whole episode. And it's not, look, I assure you, it's not just targeting um, left leaning people. I promise you that if you are a left leaning person, it's not an attack on you. But there's a new mindset that is creeping in that needs to be looked at, and it needs to be examined. And I'm going to actually intend to do that in a future episode. Now, I promised that sometime soon I would lean to my right, or I'd look to my right and target those who tend to be politically or socially on the right, and critique their approach. And their approach, I remember I talked about those moral foundations where you have, key ideas or key convictions that shape the way that you make your decisions about right and wrong. And I said that typically liberals focus highly on care and compassion and not wanting to harm people. Actually, it's true that conservatives register lower in that on that foundation. Conservatives typically, um, and if you're libertarian, I'm sorry to say, it actually even goes down a little further than that. When it comes to actually caring for people, conservatives and libertarians tend to be less compassionate. They tend to focus less on, well, I see someone hurting and I want to alleviate that suffering. Now, look, you can nuance that, and you can, you have to be a little bit careful with that, of course. But here's the other side of that. That is that conservatives tend to have a broader foundation. So they might not be as strong in the area of care and compassion, but they focus on a broader set of moral principles that begin to shape their understanding of right and wrong in the world around them. And how do you respond to systems of injustice and inequality and such. One of those other foundations that they tend to focus much more on, and that liberal and left leaning people tend to focus much less on, has to do with authority. So if you are someone who leans more on the right, now this would not be as true for if you're a libertarian, but if you're someone who leans towards the right, you probably have more respect for hierarchy and structure and systems of authority. You tend to be, So when you look at this present moment, um, what that means. Oh, and by the way, here's just a little example to kind of show this. This was a study that someone did when they looked to bring this kind of into the religious realm and the realm of the church. They looked at um, they had some researchers who gathered together a whole bunch of sermons from Unitarians who are theologically and socially very, very liberal, very, very far on the left, and then Southern Baptists who are traditionally more conservative theologically and socially. And what they did is they sort of together a whole bunch of sermons and they plugged them into a computer program that was able to analyze the word counts, and so you could kind of pick out words that would recur over and over and over again. One of the things that they found, and by the way, they also tagged words that would connect either to the left or to the right. So words like care and compassion and mercy, and then their flip side, they're sort of their inverse of like suffering and cruelty and brutality, etc. Those were all tagged to the idea of care and compassion. And then words like obey and duty and honor versus defy, and then the inverse of defy, respect, rebel. Those were tagged to being more having to do with authority and structure. So what they do is they analyze these sermons, they plug these sermons into the machines, and it's not really that surprising what they found out. The sermons in the very liberal churches tended to focus on all those, the needs to care for your fellow humanity and fellow people, etc., etc. Sermons that were on from the more conservative tradition focus more on obeying people and doing your duty and having honor and so on. So they've actually studied this and they've demonstrated this. Now, if you are a person on the conservative side of things, what will tend to happen and what you tend to find is that when it comes to the matters of race and inequality and injustice, you will tend to deny that there actually is a problem, or you'll minimize it. It's not that it's not that you're an uncaring, cold person. It's just that you will tend to minimize the reality and the experiences of other people. Um, or you'll say, this is why this explains, by the way, when you get like Black Lives Matter, and then so someone posts that on Facebook, and then immediately you say, well, Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter. What's really happening there, especially if you see, Blue Lives Matter, what you're really saying is, well, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but what about the people who are the guardians of authority? What about the people who are protecting us? What about them? And it comes across as very tone deaf to people who are in the African American community because um, they're not saying the lives of police officers don't matter. What they're saying is, look, we've been suffering and we've been experiencing a lot of mistreatment and we feel marginalized. And then someone just comes back and says, well, blue lives matter too. So what you end up getting, you end up actually minimizing the problems. You end up or dismissing the problems or downplaying them in the culture, and then nothing really changes. Nothing really changes. And what we're seeing in this moment, of course, is that this is a big topic too. But both sides become entrenched, right? Both sides dig in, and in fact, they drift further and further apart. And battle lines are drawn, and there's no. It feels like there's no hope to work through any of this or to solve any of this. So the question is, which is a very obviously very cynical and hopeless and despairing kind of thing to say, which I'm not intending to do, but nevertheless, the question is, what do we do about it? I mean, if you're a person of faith, especially if you're a person of faith, how do you you might feel stuck. I have to admit myself to feeling stuck sometimes, right? Someone emailed me and said, well, what are we supposed to do about all of this? Right? How do you move forward? How do you walk forward as a church, as a believer, as an individual? How do we? And I think it begins with trying to make sense of what's really going on. Right? Is this just is it a surfacey kind of thing where we just look at someone out of a different race or different background and we automatically dismiss them, um, and we're automatically assumed to be racist and hateful towards them, and we just got to stop it? Do we just need more education? Do we need to be, do we need to focus working only on structures? Do we need, diversity training? What do you do about it? And then that raises bigger questions too, as I said earlier. How do you try to sort out and figure out where the church fits into all of this, right? So these are, um, yeah, these are obviously, um, yeah, difficult and challenging questions, and I want to try to help us to kind of sort through all this. So here's the first thing. I think biblically, what we need to do is you need to begin understanding just the nature of the problem, right? It always kind of helps to when you got to fix something, you got to try to first understand clearly what's wrong. And I think biblically, there's a number of places that I think do that quite well. One of them is the story of it's in the Bible. It's from in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis chapter 11, and a little bit of context there. Genesis 1 through 11 are the first sort of chapters of the Bible that talk about really God's dealing with the whole of the human race, with all humankind, right? So you get creation, you get you don't have one particular people group on the scene just yet. You don't have one, you don't have God dealing just with Israel. You have God dealing with the whole of creation, and more specifically, you have the focus is on sort of the disintegration of creation, right? So Genesis 1 and 2 are the two good chapters of the whole Bible in the sense that there's nothing wrong yet. And then chapter 3 begins to introduce the problem of sin and what Christians have called the problem of sin and rebellion against God. And then beginning in chapter 3 going on through really chapter 9, what you're seeing is the outworking of that. What happens when sin takes root in the world and starts to get its way? And so you get, the story of Cain and Abel. You get brother on brother. You get a guy named Lamech who was, sort of a serial killer of his day. And the point is that this creation is just kind of coming apart at the seams, and it's deeply fractured and it's deeply broken, and you, excuse me, you get to the point of almost hopelessness and despair. And without going into all the details, that brings us right into chapter 11, because chapter 11, you get this project. You get a building project where basically humankind says, we need to come together and we're going to prove how great we are. We're going to prove sort of the strength of the human race, the power of the human race, the ingenuity, the creativity, and by building this tower up to heaven. Now, it's important to know that, and there's some discussion and debate over this, but I think it's worth noting that in Genesis chapter 10, so right before the story of Babel, there's a comment that makes it clear to us that even before Babel, there were languages over the face of the earth, right? So it wasn't that all of a sudden language was just invented after the Tower of Babel. It seems that it was in play and it was at work before the story of the Tower of Babel. So languages were already a thing, but then what happens is you get this building project, humankind coming together for the purpose of seeking and pursuing human greatness. And of course, it's not a project that God approves of for a number of reasons. One of them being God said, I want people to scatter over the earth, not clump together. I want sort of dispersion. I want image bearers sort of staking their claim in all different corners of the globe. And the people, they don't do that. And instead they say, well, we're going to seek the greatness of our name in one place, and we're going to pursue that. So what God does, He comes down and he actually judges that, which is a way of saying that he puts in place a consequence for the sins of the people, and that consequence is that the nations are scattered. In other words, if they weren't going to scatter on their own, God was going to do it for them, and God was going to spread them all out. Now, there's a whole lot more we could say about that, but what you need to know, and I think what the biblical message is from that point on, what once was something that held people together, what once was something that was not a problem, suddenly became a divisive mark within humankind. Suddenly there are fractures and there are divisions within humankind. Now, there's a lot that could be said about that. There's a lot that I think we could sort of flesh out about that. But here's a couple things. The first thing is that the biblical narrative reinforces for us that our default setting, the default setting of the human heart, is not unity. It's not to seek out commonality with people. The default setting is that we actually tend to be very groupish. We tend to identify with and be like and connect with people who are most like us. Now, this is not just true in matters of race. It's true in matters of language and culture, gender, ethnicity, cultural background, shared history, etc. We just tend to find and seek out people that are most like us, and then we clump together with them. We group together with them. So, and this has been demonstrated as well. This is not just true theologically, but it's actually been demonstrated sociologically. It used to be assumed that when people voted, that what they did is they would think about which candidate is going to benefit me the most, and they would vote on the basis of then sort of personal whatever their personal needs are, whatever candidate would do the most for them individually. But they actually studied that, and they actually have found out that there's actually evidence to show that that's not quite accurate. What people do is they tend to vote for people they tend to vote for candidates who will benefit their group the most. So, and group can mean, again, any number of things, and then probably in a lot of cases there's sort of, we all belong to different kinds of groups, and so people vote for who's going to benefit my groups the most. And so, which is a way of saying a couple of things. The problem of racism is a symptom of a deeper problem. It's our problem it's a symptom of our tendency to build our identity on a whole lot of other things: race, culture, gender, ethnicity, etc. And race is a big one. Race is a big one because it's one of the most obvious things about who we are, right? I mean, if you see someone who's Latino, if you see someone who's African American, you tend I mean, you notice that right away, and so you tend to, it's kind of the most obvious marker. Same thing with gender, but it's not; those are not the only things. It's just it's a symptom of our tendency to identify with people of our group and to cluster with them, and then to actually become suspicious or at least divided from people who are other than our group. And we do that in different ways, right? And it's to differing degrees, and there's different ways that it kind of plays out. The other thing that I think it means is it's a reminder for us that this is not a uniquely uh, white or black problem. It's not a uniquely American problem. It's a human problem, and that has implications because if we see this only in terms of white and black, one of my concerns in this whole moment is that it's important to focus, I think, on the tension between African Americans and white people because there's a really painful history there. Um, but we haven't yet. We also have to pay attention to the fact that Native Americans in the United States have also gone through a very painful experience in American history, and so racial tension, racial conflict is not just uh, white and African American people, and neither is it as simple as skin color, right? It's not just white and black or white and brown or brown and black, but it's there's plenty of cases around the world where people of different they might have the same skin color, but different ethnicities or different cultural backgrounds or different histories and so on are actually still very pitted against one another. And so when we think about this, in some ways, this has to expand our understanding of the racial and ethnic divisions and tensions within our world. It has to actually make us aware this is not just white and black. It's not just an American problem. It's a global problem. It's a fundamental problem of the human heart. So what do we do? Well, I've kind of touched on this a little bit. I think the first thing that we need to be honest about, and if you're a person of faith, you do this, I think, prayerfully. You actually seek out and you acknowledge that, hey, our default switch is groupish. It's just natural, and I think that's the biblical narrative reading us. It's telling us who we are, that we just identify with people who are most like us. I think it would be a mistake for us to just automatically assume that no, I treat all races equally. I treat everybody alike. I think that would be a mistake because I think that uh, I think that flies in the face of what the biblical narrative is, which says by default, by nature, we don't do it that way. And so I think this actually frees us up to be honest and say, well, yeah, I probably do have my biases. I probably do have assumptions that you make about other people. You probably we all probably do, and so I think we actually we have to be honest about that. And then I think it means that what that does then is that actually challenges us to not downplay the reality of differences that exist. In other words, don't dismiss people and just sort of say, well, when they say Black Lives Matter, well, Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter. Okay, but listen, don't downplay that so quickly, right? Be open to hearing. And that actually takes me into where I'm going to go next time. I'm really excited about this. I have a friend of mine, and for those of you at Sunny Slope Church, some of you will recognize and remember Nicole from Philadelphia. Um, she came in. She was on a mission team. We visited her in Philly, and then their team came to us, and we got to know Nicole a little bit that way. I've asked Nicole to join me, and we're not going to do it on Facebook. We're going to do it as a Zoom meeting, and that will allow us to have good conversation. And we're just going to talk about some of these experiences. What are some of the challenges that a person like myself, or person if you're a person of if you're white, you're not African American, and you do tend to downplay the differences. We're going to just listen and hear some of what it might sound like if you're a person of African American background, and you'll have a chance to listen in and just get to know Nicole as well. I've really enjoyed getting to meet her, and I'm looking forward to having her. So thank you for watching. As I said, this is not an exhaustive video here today. There's a lot more that I can and will say. But thank you for watching today. And if you have, by the way, I should say this too, if you have comments, please leave them either in the Facebook, or I'm going to post this on YouTube as well. So please feel free to comment, like, share, get the word out, and subscribe to my channel. And here's the last thing, if you would like to be on a video, if you want to talk about this conversation on race, I would love to have you join. I would love to have a conversation with you. Maybe you want to challenge everything that I've said, and you want to say, you know what, you don't know what you're talking about, and here's why. I would love to hear that. Let's do that. So just leave a comment, and I'll get in touch with you. And yeah, thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.